I didn't drain the lake to start a fight. That's important to say up front, because by the end of this, people will assume I did it out of spite. I didn't. I drained it because something was wrong, and I needed answers before it became a bigger problem. The lake came with the property. Not a shared amenity. Not a community feature. It was deeded land, water rights included, clearly marked on the survey I received when I bought the place. The HOA development sat uphill nearby, but not on it. At least, not legally. From the start, something felt off. The water level fluctuated in ways that didn't make sense. After heavy rain, it dropped. During dry weeks, it stayed oddly stable. I'd owned land long enough to know lakes don't behave like that unless someone is interfering. Pumps, lines, valves, infrastructure. I mentioned it casually to a neighbor from the HOA side once. Just a passing comment. Yeah, he said a little too quickly. The board handles that stuff. That was the first red flag. The board didn't handle my land. They never had. And yet, he said it like it was obvious. Like everyone knew. So I checked. County records first. Water rights. Utility easements. Power permits. Everything tied to the lake. What I found was thin. No registered power systems. No approved electrical infrastructure. No HOA access rights. Nothing. And yet, the fluctuations continued. Then came the cables. One morning, after a partial drainage for maintenance, I noticed something dark cutting across the exposed shoreline. At first, I thought it was debris. Old piping. Maybe trash. It wasn't. It was a power conduit. Industrial grade. Buried shallow. Running straight from the HOA side into the lake bed. I followed it. It disappeared back into the water at one end, and at the other, vanished toward the development. That's when the unease set in. Because there are only two reasons you run power through someone else's lake without permission. You're careless. Or you're hiding something. I contacted the HOA. Not angry. Not confrontational. Just a simple email. Can you explain why there appears to be electrical infrastructure running through my lake? The response came faster than expected. Short. Defensive. That system predates your ownership and is critical to community operations. No explanation. No permits attached. No acknowledgement that it was on my property. Just assumption. I asked for documentation. They stopped responding. Instead, I got a notice. Not from the county. From the HOA. Unauthorized interference with community utilities may result in penalties. Penalties. For touching my own land. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a control habit, one that had gone unchallenged for a long time. So, I did the only responsible thing left. I scheduled a full drainage. Permitted. Logged. County notified. Environmental checks done properly. Everything above board. If there was nothing there, the water would drain and we'd move on. If there was something illegal, it wouldn't survive exposure. And neither would the illusion holding it together. When the waterline dropped enough to reveal the lake bed, the truth came with it. Dark cables, improvised junctions, unmarked power boxes sealed in waterproof casing. An entire system. Hidden. Running without oversight. On land they didn't own. And suddenly, the lake wasn't the problem anymore. It was the evidence. The drainage didn't happen all at once. It never does when you do things properly. The water receded slowly, inch by inch, revealing more of what had been hidden beneath the surface. And with every foot it dropped, the situation went from suspicious to undeniable. The cables weren't isolated. They branched. Multiple lines ran across the lake bed, converging toward a concrete pad I'd never seen before. It had been completely submerged, invisible from shore, and now sat exposed like a secret pulled into daylight. Mounted on it were junction boxes. Improvised ones. Not utility-grade installations with stamped permits and serial numbers, but patched-together housings sealed with resin and rubber gaskets. This wasn't legacy infrastructure. This was a workaround. I brought in an independent electrical inspector. Not to accuse, just to document. He took one look and didn't even bother unfolding his ladder. This shouldn't exist, he said. That was it. No drama. No exaggeration. Just fact. He pointed out grounding issues. Improper insulation. Lines running without conduit in sections where they absolutely should have had it. Everything about it suggested speed, not safety. And this is all live? I asked. He nodded. Or it was before you started draining. That's when the calls started. First from the HOA property manager. Then from a board member. Then from someone who didn't introduce himself at all. Each call had the same message, just dressed differently. You need to stop. Not can we talk. Not there's been a misunderstanding. Just stop. They weren't worried about the lake. They were worried about what was becoming visible. I told them the same thing every time. This drainage is permitted. If you believe you have a legal interest in the infrastructure, provide documentation. They didn't. Instead, the tone shifted. This system powers community services, one board member said sharply. You're interfering with essential operations. What operations? I asked. A pause. Then lighting. Access control. Some shared amenities. Amenities. None of which were located on my land. None of which had easements crossing it. And certainly none that justified running power lines through a privately owned lake bed without disclosure. By the third day, parts of the HOA development were reacting. Streetlights flickered at night. The gate system hesitated before opening. People noticed. And when residents asked questions, boards scramble. That afternoon, an HOA notice went out blaming unexpected utility disruption and ongoing maintenance issues. No mention of the lake. No mention of ownership. Just deflection. Meanwhile, more of the system emerged as the water dropped. There were splice points wrapped in tape. Grounding rods driven into mud instead of soil. One junction box wasn't even secured, just weighed down with a stone. I documented everything. Photos. Measurements. Coordinates. Because this wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about liability. If something failed catastrophically, if someone got hurt, it would be on my land. And I wasn't going to inherit their shortcuts. I sent one final email to the HOA. This infrastructure is unpermitted and located entirely on my property. Power must remain disconnected until proper removal or legal authorization is established. That email didn't get a reply. What I got instead was a visit. 2 board members, standing at the edge of the drained lake, staring at what they clearly hoped would never be seen. Neither of them spoke at first. They just looked. Because once water hides something, it feels theoretical. Once it's exposed, it becomes real. And standing there, with their system laid bare, they finally understood something they should have realized years ago. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an illegal solution that had worked only because no one had challenged it. Until now. And the lake wasn't done draining yet. The tone changed overnight. Not gradually. Not politely. One day, they were telling me to stop. The next, they were asking if we could coordinate. That word, coordinate, is what people use when they realize they no longer have leverage. By the time the lake had drained enough to expose the full run of cabling, the HOA's internal problem had spilled outward. Residents were asking why amenities were failing, why lights were unreliable, why the gate logs showed irregular power resets. And the board had no clean answer. Because the truth couldn't be softened. The system wasn't failing. It was being revealed. County officials showed up 2 days later. Not because I called them, but because an unpermitted electrical system tied to multiple homes doesn't stay quiet once inspectors hear about it. They walked the lake bed slowly, measured distances, took photos, opened junction boxes with gloved hands. No one argued. There's a specific kind of silence that falls when professionals recognize negligence. It's not dramatic. It's efficient. One of them finally looked up and asked, "Who authorized this?" No one answered. The HOA president tried. "This infrastructure predates the current board," she said carefully. "We inherited it." The inspector nodded. "Then you inherited the liability." That was the moment everything fractured. Because HOAs are built to manage rules, not consequences. They issue fines, send letters, enforce aesthetics. They are not designed to explain why power lines were illegally routed through someone else's property for years. The inspectors issued a temporary shutdown order on the exposed segments. Anything connected to the lake system was to remain offline until reviewed, permitted, or removed. That order went public. Within hours, residents knew. And residents don't direct anger at landowners they've never met. They direct it at boards they elected. By evening, my phone was ringing again, but the tone was different. Apologetic. Careful. We're trying to resolve this internally, one board member said. We just need some time. You've had years, I replied. Another pause. Then, what would it take to make this go away? That question told me everything. They weren't looking to fix it. They were looking to bury it again. I told them no. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just no. Because the lake was drained, the system was documented, and the county was already involved. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a vote or a closed-door meeting. The next day, temporary generators appeared in the HOA development. Loud. Ugly. Expensive. A visible admission that something fundamental had gone wrong. Residents were upset. Meetings were called. Emergency assessments discussed. And through all of it, one fact kept resurfacing. The system never should have been there in the first place. I stood at the edge of the lake that evening, looking across the exposed bed. Mud cracked under the setting sun. The cables lay silent, no longer hidden, no longer useful. For years, they'd relied on water to keep questions away. They'd confused obscurity with permission. But water only hides things temporarily. Once it's gone, what remains has to stand on its own. And their system couldn't. It had no permits, no easements, no legal footing, just habit. And habit collapses fast when it's forced into daylight. The lake would eventually refill. That was never the threat. The threat was that the truth had already surfaced. And it wasn't going back under. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night. Not advertised. Not announced on the community board. Just an email marked, attendance requested. That alone said enough. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. When institutions panic, they generate noise, and noise travels. What I did get were messages. From residents I'd never met. From contractors suddenly looking for access. From a lawyer representing the HOA who introduced himself with careful neutrality and ended his first email by asking if I was open to discussion. I was. But not on their timeline. The county issued its formal notice 2 days later. It wasn't dramatic, just a list of violations, dates, and corrective requirements. Remove unpermitted infrastructure. Restore disturbed land. Provide proof of legal authorization for any remaining systems. There was no option to grandfather it in. Illegal doesn't age into legal. The HOA's attorney asked for a site walk. I agreed, on the condition that everything be documented. When he arrived, he didn't bring bravado. He brought a clipboard and a recorder. He asked clear questions, took notes, didn't interrupt. That told me he already knew the answer. This would have required multiple approvals, he said quietly, looking at the exposed cable paths. Environmental, electrical, property access. Yes, I said. And there's no easement on file, he added. No, I said again. He nodded once. Then removal is the only path forward. That sentence carried more weight than anything the HOA had said since this began. Because removal meant admission. Not just that the system was illegal, but that the board had been benefiting from it while pretending it didn't exist. Costs began stacking immediately. Contractors. Temporary power. Engineering reviews. Legal fees. Emergency reserves. Residents were notified. Not with details, but with numbers. And numbers get attention. By the following week, 2 board members resigned. Quietly. No explanation. Just names disappearing from the website. The president held on longer. Long enough to issue a statement about legacy challenges and unforeseen complications. No apology. No accountability. But that, too, ran out. The county set a deadline. Miss it and fines would follow. Daily. That kind of clock doesn't stop for politics. The removal began early one morning. Excavators entered from the HOA side. Workers pulled cables free from the lake bed carefully, section by section, under supervision. No shortcuts this time. I watched from a distance, not out of satisfaction, out of closure, because what was being undone wasn't just a system. It was a mindset. For years, they'd treated proximity as ownership, convenience as consent, silence as approval. And it had worked, until it didn't. The lake bed was graded and restored, soil replaced, disturbed areas reseeded, everything documented. By the end of the week, there was no trace left, except the records. Those don't drain away. And when the water returned, it returned to something cleaner than before. No hidden cables, no buried assumptions, just water doing what water does. The HOA didn't contact me again. They didn't need to. Because once authority is exposed as imaginary, it loses the power to intimidate. And once it's removed, it doesn't come back. The lake filled back in slowly. Spring rains did the work this time, steady and unremarkable, the way things are when no one is interfering. The shoreline returned to its familiar shape. Birds came back. The water leveled itself without pumps, without cables, without anyone pretending to manage it. That alone felt like a correction. I didn't celebrate when the last contractor left. There was no moment of triumph, no sense of victory. What I felt instead was something quieter, relief. Relief that the risk was gone. Relief that the liability was no longer mine. Relief that what belonged on my land was finally only what I allowed. The HOA adjusted because it had no choice. New systems were installed on their side, permitted properly, routed where they were supposed to be. The amenities came back online. The lights stopped flickering. The gates worked again. But something else had changed. The board stopped assuming. Notices became careful. Language shifted from demands to requests. And the word must disappeared from communications that referenced anything near my property. They had learned a boundary they couldn't redraw. A few residents reached out over time, not to argue but to ask questions. How long the system had been there? Who approved it? Why no one had checked before? I answered honestly. Because this wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. HOAs aren't villains by default. But they are structures, and structures will always push until something pushes back. Most people comply because it's easier than checking, easier than pulling records. Easier than draining a lake to see what's underneath. But ease doesn't make something right. The lake looks ordinary now. If you stood at the edge today, you'd never know what had been hidden beneath it. And that's fine. Because the lesson wasn't meant to be visible forever. It was meant to change behavior. I walk the shoreline sometimes in the evening. The water moves the way it should. No artificial hum. No buried power. Just natural stillness. That's how ownership is supposed to feel. Not loud, not aggressive, just secure. The HOA still exists. It probably always will. They still manage what they own. They still enforce what people agreed to. But they don't cross the water anymore. And they never will. Because draining the lake didn't expose a system. It exposed a belief that no one would ever look closely enough to challenge it. They were wrong. And the lake doesn't hide things for them anymore.